Tom,
Yes.
are you cool?
No.
Don't do yourself down, buddy. I think you're cool.
Well, thank you. I'll take that compliment. Yeah, I think if you call yourself cool, then you're not cool.
Ooh, what a conundrum.
It's like a reverse psychology thing.
So the New York Times.
Oh wait, but first, welcome to Beneath the Skin, show about the history of everything.
I was getting to that.
Okay, go on.
We'll get to that. Right. So, yeah, you don't think you're cool. I think
No.
you're pretty cool.
Thank you. I think you're pretty cool.
Thanks, man. I'm definitely not, but I'll
You're
take
definitely the coolest person in their 40s that I know.
Oh, okay. I'll take that. Because so in May, the reason I ask, obviously, the reason I ask is because in May of this year, so very recently. I mean, it may no longer be true. If it was true 6 months ago, it may no longer be true. Such is the nature of cool. Ask the question. This is the headline: Cool tribal tattoo. Is it from the 90s? And that, my friends, is what we're going to answer today on Beneath the Skin.
Yes, you're very welcome to Beneath the Skin. You're on the premium feed. You're getting the premium content.
Feel the quality.
I am one of your hosts, Thomas O'Mahony, and I am joined by my esteemed co-host, Dr. Matt Lauder. You know the vibes. We are talking about tribal tattooing, and we were workshopping some ideas for episodes recently, and I suggested this. You wanted a little bit of time to prepare, but it's kind of been on the back burner because, you know, everything 90s and 2000s is cool again in varying different forms. You know, kids are wearing bootcut jeans and shoes again. You know, jeans and shoe is back.
Bootcut jeans back. I can deal with the return of tribal, actually, more than I can deal with the return of bootcut jeans. Absolutely get fucked.
What if you combine the tribal with the bootcut jeans? Then you're real 2000s.
Unacceptable. Not in my 2000s. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So the reason why we this is so kind of a very pertinent episode is recently I did a poll. Aside from like the visibility of, you know, 2000 stuff coming back, we've talked about the return of Ed Hardy clothing in terms of cultural clout. This clout game funny to me.
Guess what? There's going to be more Ed Hardy in this episode. Sorry, this is a very Ed Hardy heavy show because we live in a very Ed Hardy heavy universe.
This is Ed Hardy's world. We're just living in it. But
100%. Shout out to Doug. Hi, Doug.
Hi, Doug. So I recently put a poll up on Instagram for an episode we're doing towards the end of the year. Just like what have people been doing mainly this year? And almost universally, every artist, regardless of what style they said, was like, I've had to do so much neo-tribal, which we're going to talk about later in the episode about how it differs from, you know, what we can now consider traditional tribal. It feels very weird to say that.
But the stuff that we're going to be talking about today was called neo-tribal at the time, so this is all just very confusing. As a professional historian of roughly the contemporary period, I'd like time to stop, please, so I can, you know...
History, please stop happening. But yes, we are talking about tribal. In the responses I got, like, everyone said, because I put up a couple of different questions. Also, if you're listening and you don't follow us on Instagram, bit of housekeeping, check us out on Instagram, Beneath the Skin Pod. We are giving away a £400 tattoo voucher for Darren Quinn at Leather Lane. Check
I
out
don't
the
think
Instagram.
he'll do you any tribal.
You never know, he might. Yeah, so check out the Instagram. It's pinned posts on how to win that. Winner will be announced on the 1st of December 2023. But yeah, so almost universally, every artist, regardless of style, said, I've had to do loads of like tribal stuff. And in terms of visibility, because like, you know, as Matt said, I'm cool, so I drink in cool places in London, and the visibility...
No, Tom, you're getting the causal arrow the wrong way around. The places are cool because you drink there.
Okay.
That's the way the causal arrow flows.
But even just like seeing tattoos around, like the amount of tribal I've seen in the past 6 months is insane. And like particularly like this new style, but also a lot of kind of now quote unquote retro stuff. Like we're talking stuff influenced by Leo Silhouette, which we're going to talk about. But at this cultural moment and where we're seeing the resurgence of tribal, I think it's time we sat down and talked about the history of tribal, because it's kind of a style that people don't really know its origins from.
Yeah, I don't know. So this New York Times article is a really interesting place to start, right? Because
are you quoted in it?
No, I'm not actually. Sadly,
terrible.
I know. How dare they? So the subhead is the style once dismissed for being culturally appropriative and meatheady is back. So already there you've got this kind of sense of, well, the issues of cultural appropriation, which we will talk about, and this idea of meatheady, which is interesting because I think that's something that is an insight into how culture generally, but it applies to tattoos, move from the avant-garde to the mainstream. I think Tribal's a really good example of that. I've had interesting conversations on that topic with Alex Binney over the years, who we'll also talk about. And also, this is something that is also quoted in the New York Times interview. So Dave Holmes, an editor-at-large at Esquire and an MTV host from 1998 to 2002, remembers the tattoos as part of the mid-90s uniform in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan, along with the Caesar haircut and sleeveless T-shirts. Then Mr. Holmes said, quote, "The line between Chelsea gay guy and Jersey Shore guy got super blurry. The big muscles and the eyebrow maintenance and the tribal tattoos."
But as we're going to talk about probably in a couple of minutes, I'm going to talk about specifically that person that he described.
Yeah.
Because that comes from a very, very specific cultural artifact as well.
Yeah. By the early 2000s, the article goes on, tribal tattoos had become a punchline. "What tribe are you from, Chad?" the comedian Carlos Mencia joked in a 2004 performance.
Oh God, not Carlos Mencia.
Summing up a general attitude about the designs. There was also I saw just on Instagram, it was a viral thing on Instagram that had gone, it must have been easy being a tattooer in the 2000s. All you had to do was tribal and Taz's.
No, it wasn't. What?
So there is this general sense, right, that the spiky tribal, quote unquote tribal, comes from the 90s in particular. But of course, as always, it has a much older history. And in fact, obviously what we're talking about today is not tattooing as done by actual tribes. We have done some episodes on indigenous tattoo traditions and we will do them in future. We're not talking about that today. When we say tribal, in this context, we are talking about sort of basically postmodern versions by, although not entirely, but primarily done by European and American artists on people who aren't from the cultural background of a culture that has a tattoo tradition.
Yeah, if you're not familiar, which for anyone listening, I would be shocked if you. Matt has a giant fucking pot of coffee that he's pouring himself. If you don't, think of like the Slipknot logo, like that sort of like angular kind of spikiness.
Yeah, at least one version of it is that. So, of course, there are versions. So, the earliest versions of that, if you like, are perhaps the versions of Europe, and we talked a bit about this on our episode last week when we talked about Pitcairn and the Mutiny on the Bounty. We might see the real progenitors of this in white European men, quote unquote, going native, either getting tattooed in places like Tahiti, New Zealand, or kind of claiming that they did. People like Cabri or John Rutherford, various basically European sailors often who got tattooed whilst they were in these then far-flung places. But again, as we've said at length, the impact that those design styles and traditions had on European tattooing was basically nothing. We don't see a lot of black or really any kind of black tribal-esque black work stuff to any grand degree until the middle of the 20th century. basically.
And it's also, I think, geographically, I think the cultural connotations of tribal, when you think about it, like people, like it's not really related to the Pacific at all, which most people think of when they think of like those sort of stories that you're just talking about. Like that isn't really the origins of what we think of as tribal. It's what we're going to talk about now.
Yeah. So really, what we're talking about is like, mid-century European stuff. The perhaps like exception to that, and certainly an inspiration to a lot of the people that would follow, is the tattoos that the great Omi had tattooed on himself by
George Burchett.
In the 1920s and 30s.
So George Burchett is the first tribal artist then?
Well, basically, yes, right. He claims, or Omi claimed at least, that it was his own design. And of course, what Omi was doing was trying to ape these styles, right? Trying to actually reproduce that earlier generation of sideshow performer, variety hall performer, public speaker who claimed to have been tattooed by savages in the jungles, right? And even though he was tattooed by a guy in a white coat in London, he was actually tattooed, but he claimed to have been tattooed in, by pygmies in the jungles of Borneo or something, right? And he had this incredible kind of bodysuit, I guess we call it today, including his whole face, in these very, very, very heavy black, like stripes. I mean, I wonder what you think it would have been like for the great Omi to be walking around London in the 1930s looking like he did.
Yeah, like definitely would have been a sight to see, particularly like the visibility of tattoos, of any tattoos not being as common as they even. I think even now, like, he would still be quite shocking, because obviously, like, being very heavily tattooed on your face is still quite shocking to a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just sort of constantly amazed, surprised, delighted, horrified about about people walking around with huge heavy face tattooing. And if you think about that, Omi was doing it in the 1930s, and a lot of the people we'll move on to next as we talk about an inspiration are actually paying attention to Omi, because photos of him, he was very famous right the way through till the late 1940s. He was performed in circuses all across America. He performed in variety halls in France, and was just very, very visible. Photos of him were published in magazines and circulated in the tattoo community. So Omi is this real kind of like touch point. There are then essentially we're moving into kind of the 50s and 60s, and we're thinking about California as always. A large proportion of this, and a key figure, as we touched upon a bit when we mentioned this in our last episode, is the work of Fakim Mushafar.
The modern primitives movement.
Yeah. So Mushafar, as you'll hear when Tom edits and puts out Paul's talk on this.
I'm doing it today. Well,
it'll be a good companion piece for this. He grew up in this one of the Dakotas, South Dakota, I think I'm right in saying, and found himself as a young boy drawn particularly to kind of National Geographic magazines, right? To these magazines which had a very kind of late colonial like tone to them, where European photographers, anthropologists would go out into the sort of far-flung corners of the world and take photographs of quote-unquote tribal people who living traditional and indigenous ways, and that it often included tattooing. Roland Loomis, as he was known at the time, he was born in 1930, so he's a sort of teenager during World War II. And he's buying these books and buying these magazines and seeing all of these practices, and he ends up essentially wanting to copy them. And I'm sort of we could spend a whole episode on him, and perhaps we'll do. But as I said, Paul covers his life story in a lot of detail. But essentially, to cut a long story short, over the course of the 1940s and 50s into the 60s, he begins to develop, initially basically on his own, in the sort of privacy of his own garage, these practices, or these series practices which combine everything from tattooing to piercing to body suspension to what are called sun dances, sort of versions of things taken from Native American rituals, and combines them initially as he sort of reveals himself to the world as this character performer, Fakir Mushafar, in the early 70s, as what he calls modern primitivism, right? And so there had been, there'd been other tattoo artists and other tattoo collectors also inspired by those same things before him. Perhaps the most interesting of them, again, someone we're going to talk about on the show at a separate moment in time, is this German guy called Albrecht Becker, who tattooed himself like extensively as a gay man in Berlin, and had some black work Borneo rose designs on his collarbones, and eventually ended up basically tattooing his entire body black. Like tattooing was part of his kind of sexual practice as a sexually submissive gay man. And
it's something as well that I'll come back to later in the episode when we're talking about the revival of this style as well.
Yeah, and Becker's like absolutely amazing. He was like imprisoned by the Nazis, and became this like absolute kind of inspiration to Berlin gay scenes, to the tattoo world, etc. When his work was revealed, he's an incredible artist as well, very interesting photographer. But loads of his tattooing begins as direct appropriation of things that he's seen in magazines. Of black work, and then becomes much more extensive as time goes on. But yeah, Mushafar is, I think, our kind of first key figure here, basically because it's around him that a lot of this stuff is made visible to the world. Eventually through this book, Modern Primitives, which came out in 1989, although in earlier versions as well. And it's also through which a lot of the rhetoric around this became quite ossified in the public imagination. I've written about this a long time ago. I mentioned again on our Samuel Stewart episode that Sammy wrote about this in the early 90s, like very early 90s, just after the book came out, that he found the kind of representation of all of these variety of different practices under the banner of primitive was quite problematic for all kinds of reasons. But different times. Mushafar didn't tattoo himself. He has this huge back piece done by an artist called Dave Slack. And yeah, I think like it is the coming together of this kind of late hippie, post-hippie California version of cultural, kind of new age stuff, I guess we might call it now, with this kind of personal fascination of Mushafar's with anthropological photography, which starts to kind of bring together, certainly for the Republic audience, this idea of black work, and certainly the publication of Modern Primitives, which came out in 1989, became an enormous influence all around the world for a whole generation of people. The book is super interesting. Again, we haven't got time to go into it in detail, but there's loads of figures in there, many of whom aren't really describable as modern primitives at all. Ed Hardy features, for example, in the book. Lyle Tuttle features in the book. Various other people who aren't part of this, obviously part of this heading of modern primitives, are in the book. Most of the writing about the book actually focuses on Mushafar himself, and doesn't really pay attention to the complexity and the interesting kind of diversity that's within. And
I think as well, at this time, when you're talking about moving out of the kind of post-hippie era of like the late 60s, early 70s. I would argue, you know, the hippie era ended in 1975 with the withdrawal from Saigon. But
Yeah.
you have this growing fascination, and I call this, you know, like a postmodern fascination with the primitive, that like we culturally have conquered the world. Everything has been discovered. And it's this weird Western cultural chauvinism obsession with the primitive as this kind of more authentic way of living. And you see that through, you know, the growth in popularity, partially responsible for the growth of popularity of stuff like National Geographic, that is exposing day-to-day people to these far reaches of the world where people are kind of living out of step with time.
Yeah, and in fact, you know, there's lots of sociology and anthropology on that exact question, that after times of conflict, there is a kind of often an upswing of, you know, beliefs in magic and spiritualism. Like, we're even seeing it now post-COVID and post-pandemic with rise of interest in the occult and witches and astrology. And there is a kind of, you know, sort of nostalgic yearning for a simpler time, which pre-modern societies get to kind of stand in problematically as avatars for. I mean, the Modern Primitive book came out in 1989, chronicling. It has been called a movement, the Modern Primitives. I've argued that I don't think there really was a movement of Modern Primitives. I think there was a few people that Fakir Musafar knew, who self-identified as Modern Primitives, but then there were a lot of people who found the stuff interesting and copied it and remixed it in the following decades, but who wouldn't really be either describe themselves or be described as Modern Primitives. And there's lots of people in the book, as I said, who don't fit into that gap. So, but on that note, I mean, so that's came out in 1989, and Musafar had been, you know, doing this stuff privately through the 40s and 50s and 60s, and revealed himself to the world as Fakir Musafar in the 70s. Mm-hmm. But earlier than that, you know, there were, again, tattooers who were starting to draw upon these styles. The most interesting of which is someone who we've also talked about a lot, Cliff Raven, old Chuck Ingram, taught by Sammy Stewart. Cliff actually says in an article that he wrote back in 1981, something that I think probably resonates with what you're saying. With Western civilization crumbling down around our ears, what could be so bad about putting on a little war paint? Right.
And it's also this idea, this is Tom's sociocultural corner, is that like this idea that civilization as we think of it doesn't really exist, that it is something that is constantly in decay and never in growth. It's like there is always, like, you know, civilization as we know it will never provide enough, like, kind of substantive reason for existence, so you have to like grasp at other things. So it's like, oh well, like these people in, you know, the jungles of Borneo, they have it figured out. Yeah,
it's a very, I mean, again, there's a lot of kind of sociology on this exact problem, and this is what, again, we talked about in our response comments to the Pinky Young episode. Like, this also is basically Orientalism and racism, even in a of a kind, at least, and it's very complicated. I'm not, you know, again, not saying people with black work tattoos are racist. This gets much more complicated than that. But this sociological current that we're talking about of mythologizing and fantasizing about pre-modern societies is often, not unavoidably, but is often tinged with a kind of, as you said, a Western cultural chauvinism.
And it's also kind of like trying to apply a kind of postscript meaning to something in order to make it like meaningful. And these are just, you know, like cultural practices that have evolved over time naturally within a culture. And we're like, oh, well, you know, it's like this design is like, oh, you know, the sun god, all this sort of stuff. Yeah. And it's like, in reality, you can just admit you think the design is cool.
Well, I think that's a good, again, transition to the next point I wanted to make, actually, which is that I think there's an important difference between, and actually Musafar wasn't even doing this really to really steelman him, but there are people even today who, and certainly, are kind of basically reproducing that kind of 19th century version that I was talking about, who find a kind of authenticity, a problematic authenticity in inverted commas in these kind of practices, right? That you go somewhere and you get an authentic tattoo as a visitor, and that's somehow more spiritual and more spiritual. I mean, all of this is in quote marks, right? I don't think any of these categories are actually possible. But compared to a kind of aesthetic and technological appreciation of how this works, and I think Muzaffar again is not. I mean, in the kind of remixing and recreation and mixing together of lots of these different practices all over the world is doing a bit of that, but prior to modern primitives coming out in 1989, almost a decade earlier, Ed Hardy published what is probably the first tattoo history magazine.
Oh, you bastard! You're shut. Like, if you listen to the last episode, you understand how jealous I am. Matt's holding up tattoo time.
This is a second edition also from 1989. This is the 1988 printing, the second edition.
Doug,
which came
if you're
out.
Listening and can hook me up with some copies of Tattoo Time, I will pay.
But this initially came out in 1982. And yeah, like this first edition of the book is something that sets up all of the people probably that would become part of that modern primitives conversation a decade later. And Hardy, and that quote that I shared with you from Raven is in Tattoo Time. The title of this first ever episode is New Tribalism, right? And Hardy's interesting on this, as he is on everything, because he's aware of the complexity of this move. And Raven is as well. Basically, what Hardy and Raven and some other people who we'll come to in a second in this book realize is that there's something kind of graphically connective, interestingly connective about heavy black tattooing. So Ed says in the introduction to the first ever issue of Tattoo Time, tattoo tradition as evolved in the West over the past 100 years leans heavily on quote unquote exotic subjects adapted from other cultures. Dramatic, he talks about Japanese tattooers. He says the majority, these dramatic black and grey energy channels that lend native Japanese tattooing its unique visual impact may be misunderstood, bastardized, or awkwardly interpreted by a majority of tattooers in the West, but the gravitation to a dynamic black tattooing with abstract elements is present. The appeal of abstract or primary elements is at work in the mid-20th century's most popular design, the Black Panther, first adapted to tattooing by Milwaukee artist Armand Dietzel from a 1934 children's book on mythology. The crawling form of the cat has an ideal design to fit arm, leg, or other body musculature. And he then points out, right, that so there's something graphic about this, and Hardy is as much interested in the graphic potential as this as he is with some pseudo-mystical, appropriative or claim for authenticity. There are bits of that come up in the first issue of Tattoo Time, but a lot of the discussion is about the aesthetic possibilities of what he calls new tribalism, right? What he calls in a letter to Lau Hardy the new old style, right? This remixing of heavy black traditions to graphic ends. This is something that had been going on in California for a while by this point. Cliff Raven had been tattooing this stuff since the 60s. Tom DeVita, who has a huge, really interesting set of had a huge set of sleeves at work by different artists working in black styles. He was a big, important figure. Hardy says, DeVita has promoted the black look with a highly unique fusion of world culture images in his flash for the past 15 years. So since the mid-50s. He also then goes on to cite a guy in New Zealand called Roger Ingerton, who I'll come back to in a minute. Michael Malone, so Rollo, Candy Everett as well. So there's this right. So we have, I think, a lot of the really interesting, a lot of the really problematic stuff. You have them clashing, right, in this comparison between these two books. You have Modern Primitives, which aims clumsily from an outside perspective to mash these things together to make a coherent quote-unquote movement. And then you have Tattoo Time, which is interested primarily in the graphic approach to this, although does include an essay by two really interesting writers who both go and get tattooed in Samoa. One is called Leo Brereton, who worked for Lyle Tuttle for a long time, who did a lot of kind of tattoo anthropology back in the 70s and 80s. And then another guy called Dan Tomei, similarly, a merchant sailor and gypsy tattooist, currently on Tattoo Odyssey of the Indo-Pacific. So there is that mix of the ideological and the visual in that first issue. But the comparison between Tattoo Time issue 1 and Modern Primitives, I think, is really instructive of how we get where we are today.
And obviously, like, Hardy being much more concerned with the aesthetic of it, as we're moving away from the 80s and, the publication of Modern Primitives, how do we get to what we visually consider tribal now? Obviously, we're probably talking Leo Zulueta.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Leo Zulueta is the other name in that list that I didn't mention, right? So Hardy says, San Francisco tattooer Leo Zulueta is the first New World artist to base his entire style on tribal patterns, symbols, and blackwork. There's an essay by Zulueta in Tattoo Time about the swastika and its meaning and its history. But he also features, Leo Zulueta also features in Modern Primitives. Who did Leo Zulueta's sick blackwork tattoos? Ed Hardy.
It's Ed Hardy's world. We're just living in it.
Exactly. So Zulueta, as Hardy says, other artists had been inspired by either directly or implicitly by heavy black, cool looking stuff for a while, but it's Zulueta particularly. Although I think, as I said, this New Zealand-based white Pekea artist Roger Ingerton is also part of that story. He became very important in the links between Maori tattooing and its revival in New Zealand with the global tattoo scene through his connections with this scene. But Zulueta, is if you want to think about where what we think of as the tribal armband and stuff comes from, it's Leo Zulueta. So Zulueta, So Zulueta was born actually in Maryland in 1952, but he grew up in Hawaii, in Oahu, and in San Diego. So he has this kind of cross-cultural connective tissue anyway, right? Like he was born to a Pacific family, but in the United States. He goes to art college in San Diego State, studies art, and becomes really interested in the traditions, particularly in Borneo. He began traveling. He was also, again, kind of interested in this kind of, California moment of the 60s. He sort of has these almost pilgrimages, I suppose, to places like Samoa and Tahiti. He meets Ed Hardy in 71 and becomes a professional tattooer in 81. And it's really interesting. But again, for all of his engagement with these traditional cultures, Zulueta says in his first sentence in the interview in Modern Primitives, several people influenced me. Ed Hardy was the biggest inspiration. He encouraged me to study tribal designs from Polynesia, Borneo, etc., long before I even started tattooing. When I grew up in Hawaii, I had a lot of Filipino relatives with tattoos and always admired them. The ancient Hawaiians didn't emphasize tattooing as much as the Marquesans or Samoans, but nonetheless, they did have a strong tattooing tradition. So he has this fine art background. He's interested in Native American art, for example. He likes jewelry and furniture making. But he realizes that, this black work stuff is for him. He's tattooed by Mike Malone in Hawaii. Again, all these weird connections, even with like Sailor Jerry, and then meets Ed Hardy and realizes like this is it. And again, what does he say? I used to hang out at Realistic Tattoo, looking at Ed's photo albums of tattoos. I spent a lot of time hounding used bookstores and collecting old magazines like National Geographic. Ed kept encouraging me, this is great. There aren't many people doing this or getting tattoos like this. You should further your studies. After a year or two, I told Ed I wanted to get a big tribal style flame on my arm. He said, you draw it, bring it to me, I'll put it on. That was 1978. Then I got the matching piece on my left arm in 81. He created this, style in this melting pot of graphic art, punk, multicultural, Pacific, naval base culture / San Francisco San Diego art schools. He also, of course, through that meets Cliff Raven. He meets Bob Roberts. He meets this guy Leo Berriton, who is working for Lyle. He works for Dan. He meets Dan Tomei as well. So all of this it comes through Leo to create this amazing kind of set of remixes of black work. And what happens is Leo basically sells Flash. There are design sheets in Modern Primitives, many of which are actually drawn by Hanky Panky in Amsterdam.
Mm-hmm.
So he also has a big kind of role to play here for translating these designs into European vernaculars. But Leo publishes this basic design book of classic designs, and that becomes really the kind of blueprint for tattoos all over the world to either copy it or to adapt it for their own styles, and we're off to the races. And what happens is this creates an appetite for a new style of quote unquote tribal work that isn't so connected or as connected with this idea of culturally appropriative work. In fact, because these styles, Leo's work initially is coming directly from places like Borneo, but they become adapted. These aren't quote unquote traditional tribal tattoos. They're something new, which come out of this cultural fusion and are inflected ideologically, but have all this incredible kind of artistic possibility. As that's circulated around the world, and Leo, in that New York Times article actually that I mentioned, he's interviewed there, and he says, a lot of people made a lot of money from that book that I made. And he says there are a lot of people trying to do it and screwing it up.
Yeah, and this is, and you mentioned Hanky Panky, and I think in terms of like the cultural significance of tribal in the 90s, one, Hank is the designer for Blood Sugar Sex Magic's cover art, and that I think that is a big exposure to a lot of people of like what tribal would be.
Zio Lewis himself tattooed Dennis Rodman. He tattooed Tommy Lee. There were, as you pointed out, like tribal tattoos in From Dusk Till Dawn.
That's the origins of the Caesar cut and the tribal tattoo.
Yeah.
If anyone knows who was the makeup designer on that movie, please let us know, because I would love to talk to them about it.
Yeah, must be able to find out that. And all of the other of key one is Blade, right? This is this interesting intersection with African American tattooing, Dennis Rodman, and then the tattoos that Wesley Snipes had put on for the Blade movie. Really brings this kind of tattooing into African American culture as well. Huge, incredible moment.
And it's interesting as well, like the cultural significance of tribal in the 90s. Once again, we are going into Tom's socio-cultural corner. You look at like the cultural movements that emerged within the 90s, that emerged in the 90s, and you have stuff like grunge, new metal, tribal tattooing. You have the kind of cutesy Disney stuff, the Looney Tunes stuff that's becoming popular as well. And what I think a different lens to look at this is in terms of, it is really the full-throated birth of neoliberalism in the 90s. You have essentially you're living in Francis Fukuyama, end of history. Like we've solved all the problems, everything's fine. just consume, live your life, blah, blah, blah. And it's like you have this kind of cultural malaise set in of the kind of staidness of society. Like, we've solved all the world's problems, there's no more wars, and just go to work, make products, consume products. And culturally, you have stuff like grunge and nu metal, and like particularly the kind of the mainstream growth of hip hop. You have this undercurrent of a kind of dissatisfaction with modernity and modern life. So, you know, you have nu metal expressing the kind of rural American angst that really captures a lot of people in stuff like early Korn albums and other stuff like Deftones. I don't care if Deftones don't call themselves a nu metal band, they're a nu metal band, whatever. But I think this also kind of plays into the growth of tribal tattooing, is that, you know, if you look at something like, you know, Edward Bernay's conception of teenagers and youth, and then you have someone like Thomas Frank's conquest of cool, and the commercialization of counterculture, in the same way that nu metal and grunge and commercial 90s hip hop that was in the mainstream became very capitalized on quite quickly. You have tribal tattooing becoming the visual expression then of this kind of, the Bernays conception of like the consumer tribe is like, oh, well, we're different than everyone.
Yeah, but I think, and at least I've written about this, that does get, particularly with tattooing, gets over-determined though, right? Because a lot of writers, sociologists in the 90s, and this was one of the things that made me become a tattoo historian, because I was reading this stuff. I went to university in 1998. I did a master's degree in 2002, which was about the sociology of the body. A lot of interest in corporeality in late 90s, early 2000s sociology and the humanities. It gets called the corporeal turn, right? Well, all of a sudden everyone's paying attention to the body. It's a really important moment for performance art. Of course, we're dealing with the HIV/AIDS pandemic at the time, all this stuff. Anyway, but a lot of sociologists who are writing about tattooing, they read every blackwork tattoo as an appropriative attempt to achieve something primitive and authentic, and failing, right? And as I wrote about in my article about Modern Primitives, the book, the article is called The Myth of the Modern Primitive, is that I don't think that adequately describes what's happening at all, right? Because there are definitely there's definitely a kind of ideological strain of people doing that. I mean, like Robbie Williams, for example, getting Maury-esque tattooing, you know, people that are more actively kind of or Angelina Jolie, you know, all these celebrities that are actively leaning into kind of the narratives of quote unquote tribal tattooing in its non-Western sense. Mushafar's part of that story, although I think I do accept I was probably a bit harsh on him in that article. No, I was. I think now I understand more about him with the hindsight of like 10 or 12 years more research and thinking about it. I think I was a bit over harsh on him. Nevertheless, I think that account of mid-90s tribal misses out the fact that a lot of it is coming from people like Ed Hardy and Leo Zulueta and Cliff Raven, who think it's cool and who think and who don't see it as something atavistic or backward, but who see it as a kind of either as a kind of resetting of a kind of visual vernacular, right? If you kind of take that account of what Hardy's saying in that first intro to New Tribalism, where he's saying this kind of tattooing has always been around everywhere, graphically speaking, or if you take the kind of Cliff Raven take on it, which is a bit more ideologically inflected, but is still thinking about its place in the modern world, or if you take what Leo's doing and going, here's these amazing designs from history, I'm going to use them as the basis for a whole new design language. It's difficult to reduce that, as sociologists do, to this is just people who don't like the modern world. Although I agree with you that is a huge part of it.
Well, I think less so that like the anti-modernity thing is the main influence. I think really it's just that it's like so visually distinctive from tattooing that came before. That's what appealed in the 90s.
That's right. And we see that just historically anyway with tattooing and with all kinds of fashion things. And this is the story that I was alluding to at the beginning. As things become, change over time, people don't want the thing that came before them, right? Because it's out of date. It takes a decade or a decade and a half for something to become vintage, right? But if it's 5 years old, it's unfashionable. If it's 50 years old, I spoke to a really interesting figure in this story for the UK is Alex Binney, who was at art school in the 80s, who read Modern Primitives, who was tapped into this scene, who ended up going out to California and getting tattooed by Leo, and basically coming back and bringing black work. I'm massively simplifying this story, but bringing black work back to the UK. But he said, he started out doing all these incredible big graphic post Leo Zulueta back pieces and armbands and stuff. And then by the time I was really starting to get tattooed a decade later, right, in the early 2000s, that was stuff I didn't want to get because it was diluted, it was watered down, it had become the kind of, as that New York Times article says, the meatheady builder tattoo. And we've seen that with fashion, we've seen that with architecture, we see it with interior design, you see it with tattooing, what the cutting edge stuff. And we talked about this when we talked about Russian prison tattooing. The Russian prison tattoo style, when that 2007 set of Fuel books came out, was super, super cutting edge for ages and edgy, and now it's on like pop stars and not cool and a bit lame and cliched. And that's the rhythm that tribal tattooing took. I sent you that photo, which I hope you can put on Instagram, that I took of my friend Ryochi from Japan, who, again, after reading Modern Primitives, made a fucking pilgrimage in the early 90s to California to get tattooed by Leo, and has one of the greatest tattoos I've ever seen. A full tribal sleeve, neo-tribal sleeve from Leo, that when Ryochi closes his elbow to move his arm, like to sort of, flex his bicep, if you like, to move his arm up, the design stays contiguous. Like it connects itself. Like it's absolutely mind-blowing. Yeah, it's so good. And when you see how we got from that to what the version that I was seeing, done on the builders that were working around the corner from my school in the late 90s, is just astonishing.
And it's I think as well, because obviously we're coming to the close, I want to talk about like the current cultural moment that we're having right now. And
this rebirth.
And I kind of have a general theory about where, like, not just in terms of tattooing, but other aspects of culture in terms of fashion, social culture in terms of socializing. But I think there's a couple of reasons for what people are now calling neo-tribal. Some people are calling cyber sigilism because of like they're applying Thomas Frank's ideas of like social tribes to the digital age. We all exist online, that sort of thing. But it's also, I think part of it is being fueled by, because obviously a lot of the people that are getting it are, they're cool, they're hip. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, they would have been called hipsters. And when you think about that moment when like that term had its most cultural cachet 10 to 15 years ago of hipsters, the tattoos they were getting were the Russian prison stuff, but also they were getting like very, very colorful traditional stuff. They were getting, anchors, lighthouses, swallows. It became like a joke pretty much that like, oh, you have like a very deep cut t-shirt and you have like nautical tattoos, but you've never spent time on a ship or whatever. And I think part of the reason, alongside the cultural reappraisal of stuff from the 2000s, why tribal has come back is, I think, in part a reaction to the prevalence of that sort of tattooing in the 2010s.
Yeah.
That like we have exhausted the resource material for a lot of American traditional stuff, and those, and to someone who's 21, like the people who have those tattoos are in their early 30s, they're gauche, they're uncool, they're not hip anymore. Whereas what are you going to get? You're going to get like fine line tribal stuff on your hands or on your back. And there's an incredible artist in Germany, in Berlin. And part of the reason why this stuff is also called Berlin tribal is that like it's very prominent in like the techno scene, in the queer scene in
Well,
Berlin.
this is also, again, funnily enough, one of the things that comes up in that New York Times article. It mentions Berlin as a real locus for this stuff anyway.
Yeah, 100%. I just want to find that artist. I think it's a G-Fans or it's something like that. But I think that's a big reason is like people who are like 21 or like in their early 20s are looking at the fashion styles of the 2000s. They're looking at like the tattoos of them as well, and they're like, those are actually really cool.
Yeah, Grafsance.
Grafsance, yes.
So Grafsance is quoted in that New York Times article that I cited earlier on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
and like and because it's like it's mean looking as well. Like in retrospect, a lot of the tattoos from the 2010s, they're like kind of cutesy and like a little bit like childish in some ways. So like people are post-COVID, like we're living in, like a mean, cruel world after COVID. So it's like, let's get mean, cruel tattoos. I think the difference is that people are getting them in much more visible places, on their hands, on their neck, on their face, that sort of thing. But I think it is super interesting in where it's leading to, because stylistically it's changed so much. It's fine line. It's no longer solid black. Ironically, I was talking to an artist and they were saying the fact people are getting it in fine line is a blessing, because when they want to cover it up, it'll be easy.
Well, also, of course, black stuff is easiest again in inverted commas to remove, right? So there's also something there which is funny. I mean, it was worth pointing out on this revival stuff that the other thing that I find super interesting here, and it's something that again I'm not entirely qualified to talk about, and there are people who have written about this interestingly. As one of the things that's been really interesting is tattoo tourism, right? And tattoo revivalism. And again, we talked a bit about this with Maya, and there are revival movements happening all across the world where young tattooists and old tattooists even are reinvigorating, in some cases reinventing extinct or endangered tattoo traditions, and a lot of that is supported and supportable by tourism, by visitors to those cultures getting tattooed, which is good in many ways, but also comes again with this kind of slightly problematic chauvinistic account of authenticity. I've been asked in the past to do some TV stuff where go to a tribal context, go to a traditional tattoo cultural context and get tattooed, and I'm not interested in doing that because of all the reasons I've alluded to today. And I've been really struck on that by how, so the real kind of best example of that navigation, and I don't know how complicated it is what's happened in New Zealand, or is happening in New Zealand. And again, this is something that even artists, Maori heritage artists in New Zealand disagree about. But there has been a development in New Zealand as people wanted to come and get tā moko, the traditional tattooing practice of Maori people, but weren't themselves of Maori heritage. There has been a kind of cultural movement to develop what's become known as kiritui, which means like skin art in New Zealand. But and some tattooers of both Maori and non-Maori heritage have said, we can tattoo stuff that is in the design vernacular of tā moko, but it's not tā moko, it's this other thing. But that's been really controversial. In fact, on a really interesting website called artbody.co.nz, they basically say tā moko is not kiritui, and this modern word kiritui does not serve us well. It misleads people to think that a tattooed copy of a Maori design or a sort of moko, or claims by non-Maori that they know moko are authentic. But that is, again, something that upon which Maori artists themselves disagree. I'm not one to adjudicate on who has the better claim on that argument. But it is, as people are seeking out these kind of design languages, but also seeking out the kind of, as you mentioned, the quote-unquote authentic experiential versions of them, these are conversations we're going to have to keep having. I mean, the other flip side of this conversation that I see, and it's something that I know Aaron Dieterwolf on his Archaeology Inc. page has also addressed, is that cultural appropriation story and the myth of it goes the other way as well. So you do see well-meaning Indigenous activists from various cultural traditions around the world saying tattooing was stolen from us by white people, and all tattooing is culturally appropriative. The phenomenon of tattooing is something that was stolen from our ancestors. And of course, that isn't true either, because, again, as we talked about at length, as I talk about in my book, the idea that tattooing has no presence in the West is itself a product of colonial erasure. So it's a very, very complicated thing. I want to sort of say to people who are listening, who are into this kind of stuff, and some of it is very cool indeed, and who want to get it, like, seek out the design histories of people like Cliff Raven, Leo Zulueta, the stuff that Ed had done, the stuff that Freddie Corbin, the stuff that Lyle Tuttle, as I said, all of these like pioneers of the 70s were doing that is not straightforwardly lifted. Candy Everett, like stuff that is not straightforwardly lifted or copied from someone pair, but it's instead something else.
Yeah, like it. I think it's super interesting, like tribal having a cultural resurgence, but also like it's being created in this kind of newer style that has its own sensibilities. I'm calling it now for anyone who's listened this far into the episode. 6 months' time, the neo-tribal thing will have faded away. Next big thing, Celtic knotwork. Get practicing your Celtic knotwork now. But I want to thank you all for listening to the show. As we said on the last episode, we are now fully independent, so this show and its continuation is directly supported by you, our patrons. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to follow us on Instagram and find out about the competition, check us out Beneath Skin Pod. Link will be in the description of this episode. Paul's talk on Fakir Mushafar will be out either later today or tomorrow as a companion piece to this episode, if you want to learn more about the modern primitives movement. But I also want to thank our £10 and above patrons. That is Morpheus Ravenna, Chris Block, Shit Jesus, Kirsten Wright, Kathleen Burkhardt, James Schick, and Charlie Lightning. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a review or share an episode with your friends. We're getting a lot of good buzz. We are now the best history podcast in the UK, the best independent history podcast in the UK. And I want to say thank you for listening, and it's goodbye from me.
Thank you very much for listening. Don't get a mock on your face if you're not Maury.